Okay, you heard Katie mention Anthony Housefather there. Housefather is a Quebec Liberal MP and the co-chair of this interparliamentary task force on online anti-Semitism that met today in Washington. So, Mr. Housefather, you heard from Meta, Twitter, and YouTube today. Do you think your committee's making progress? Are you convinced they're doing enough to stop online anti-Semitism?
So we also heard from TikTok with 4 big ones. And what I would say is no. I think they all have good intentions, but I think that there's a real dichotomy between what people in Parliament, our task force, the general community believes, and what these platforms claim. They say they're taking so much of the hate off, and we just don't see that. We keep pointing to many posts that have been there for months that clearly are hateful and in violation of their rules.
So what more do you want to see from them? I mean, is there any progress at all here, or is it pretty much status quo?
Well, I think there's been some progress in terms of the platforms making effort to do better training for content moderators and engaging more content moderators, and trying their best with artificial intelligence to take posts off. But the exponential growth of anti-Semitic and other posts is clearly showing that's not enough. What we need to do is we need to have the platforms be more transparent. Their transparency reports don't indicate what type of hate is out there that they're taking off. So, for example, they don't distinguish between anti-Semitism and Black racism or Islamophobia, and they don't give us the data, the underlying data that they claim shows they're doing such a great job. So what we're asking for is independent audits of the platform, and we're asking as well for the platforms to take better care. And if we have to impose a duty of care as legislators, we have to do that because right now we're not seeing the progress.
Right. So these platforms are global. The fight against anti-Semitism, you've said it needs to be a global effort and can't just be fought at home. But it does need to be fought at home. And consultations on your government's own promised online harm bill, those had to restart over the summer. And things are kind of stalled there. So how much longer do you think until your government takes some aggressive action on this?
Well, I think you need to consult in order to make sure that you have the right rules. And I think also the goal of our task force is to ensure that we have rules that are followed across the world. You can't have 30 different rules in 30 different countries. That just doesn't work. So the purpose of the task force is to make recommendations to our own governments, to our own legislatures, as to how to frame that type of a law. And I think looking at Britain's online harms bill is an excellent start. I think we need to impose a duty of care on the platforms. And I think we also need to impose algorithm transparency, where we understand what their algorithms are doing. Are they sending hate to hate, as appears to be what's happening, where if a post is more dramatic, the more likes and the more comments it gets, the more you send people there. And often that drives hate to hate. We need to understand from the platforms what they're doing with algorithms. So those are my 2 big recommendations that I've made to the minister and the department in terms of the bill. And I think that's the direction our task force is now going in.
You say we can't have 30 different countries with 30 different rules, but that's going to have to exist to some degree, is it not? I mean, you mentioned the United Kingdom, they have an online harm bill, but the ability to regulate speech in the UK versus, say, the United States with their First Amendment rights, it's vastly different, right? So are you not going to get some unevenness in trying to deal with this?
So that's a great question. So the First Amendment is not unlimited. It is true that in other countries, for example, in Canada, because of Section 1 of our charter, we're able to impose reasonable limits. But the United States court jurisprudence has said, for example, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. You can't do things that incite imminent harm. And I think that there's all kinds of regulations in the United States related to broadcasters, related to pretty much every other industry. And I think both algorithm transparency is possible under the US Constitution, and I think a duty of care is possible under the US Constitution. So I think we're working in a direction where we can reach a reasonable international standard that US Congress can pass, and the Canadian Parliament can pass, UK Parliament can pass, and that we would have a relatively similar framework. Because again, the platform's taking something down in one country and being fined for it, it doesn't mean that material is taken down everywhere else.
Right, and so the issue is, one of the big issues is who takes down the material, who's responsible for taking down the material. And one of the delays in the online harm bill is because experts can't really agree on whether the software companies should have a monitor and what harm actually is. I mean, is it your view that legally we need to make these platforms directly responsible for removing and monitoring anti-Semitic and other harmful content?
I do think that they need to be legally and financially responsible for doing that. I wouldn't impose criminal penalties, but I do think that civil fines are indeed the answer here, if indeed they don't meet a reasonable standard of care. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't necessarily mean saying that if you don't take a post down within a certain number of hours, you're fined. That's one way of doing it, but that's not necessarily the way the UK is going or the way I would recommend. But the duty of care standard is important. And in the end result, the platforms have control. They're private companies. Some of them are bigger than many countries. And they have to be held to a certain level of responsibility. And unless everyone does it, then they're put in a position where they can, for example, remember what Facebook did in Australia. They threatened to pull out of Australia with respect to the bargaining for news to be paid for there. So we want to make sure we're relatively common across at least the English-speaking world.
I don't think we've spoken since the issue involving your own government's funding of a communications company where Laith Marouf's tweets were viewed as anti-Semitic. You would flag this with the department that gave them the contract, and you've called for all MPs to condemn his tweets. Are you satisfied with the way your government and your colleagues have responded to this one?
So let me just say that I think that Laith Marouf should never have been funded. I think his funding should have been pulled much faster the minute that we became aware of the fact that he was a virulent anti-Semite. The legal niceties are important, but in this case, I think the legal niceties could have been skipped. And I am pleased with the fact that we're moving in a direction of changing the contracts, changing the application forms, changing the self-certification form. And we've been working closely with the minister to make sure that the language is appropriate in that so that it can never happen again. But I was disappointed as a Jewish MP that, and I look at all parties here, that so few members of parliament from all parties immediately joined in the call to condemn this anti-Semitism, because really it shouldn't be left to Jewish MPs to carry the ball on this. We should all be standing up for everybody else. And I did kind of feel that the Jewish MPs were left carrying the ball on something where everyone should have joined in faster. So, I don't think that's a question of people being in bad faith. I think it's a question of all of us prioritizing different things. But what was a huge priority for me wasn't necessarily the number one priority for others. And it sort of felt hurt. It felt hurtful. And I think the Jewish community felt hurt. And it reminded me as a clarion call that when I have other communities out there that are being attacked, whether Indigenous, Black, LGBTQ+, et cetera, I've got to make sure to stand up and be loud and be early and be strong.
Well, given the sluggish response on this, though, and sort of the lack of condemnation that you're calling for, I mean, do you trust your government to take meaningful action on anti-Semitism after what happened with the Laith Marouf case here?
I don't. First of all, the Department of Canadian Heritage that gave the grant, that was given by civil servants, not the government. The only thing that I would suggest that the government could possibly be faulted on is a late taking too long to terminate the contract. I think this government has an extraordinary record on anti-Semitism. We're the first government to hold a summit on anti-Semitism. We're the first to name a special envoy on anti-Semitism. We're the first to adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. This government has actually done more on anti-Semitism than any government I can remember in Canadian history. This is one outlier. So of course I trust the government, but the question again is, in terms of this incident, it wasn't handled in the fastest way, and I was disappointed at not being handled faster. But that's not you can't take one thing and then say the overall record of the government is not good or you don't trust the government. This government's done a really good job on anti-Semitism.
Okay, Anthony Housefather, thanks for your time.
Have a wonderful day. Thanks, David.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.